I want to ask you a personal question. What is the worst thing you have ever done? Maybe you betrayed someone that really did not deserve it. Or maybe you totally got your revenge on someone in the craziest way that you can imagine. Whatever it is that you did, how terrible, who was affected, I am a very strong believer in the idea that we don't naturally want to do these terrible things. Are there some outliers? Well, sure, there are some people that really get off and they just really love inflicting pain and suffering on other people for no reason. But most people, most of the time, don't want to do that kind of stuff. So it kind of begs the question, what can lead someone to doing something terrible? And one of the really common answers is mental illness. Someone commits suicide, in retrospect, oh, they must have been depressed. Someone murders this other person for seemingly no reason. And it's like, oh, maybe he was psychotic, right? Maybe he had some kind of problem that no one knew about. And this is one of those ideas that gets applied to Adolf Hitler, and it's just such a fascinating topic. So in this episode, we are going to try to get to the bottom of the question of whether or not Adolf Hitler was mentally ill, and if so, what was his mental illness? Hello there, friends, and welcome back to History for Thinkers, a show that brings history to life. I want to give a personal thank you to everyone over on Patreon for supporting the show, making this content possible. I want to especially thank Matthew for being the top tier financer over on Patreon. So if you guys want exclusive content and to get a shout out at the start of every episode, head on over to patreon.com/historyforthinkers. With that out of the way, let's get into the episode. So one of the first things we need to do before we even get into this episode is we need to talk about mental illness and part of the problem of diagnosing Adolf Hitler. Now, the field of psychology is very complicated and it is very, very difficult to accurately diagnose someone. I mean, you need years and years of professional training and even then sometimes, not everyone's just cut out for it, right? And then diagnosing from afar adds another layer of complexity. At the end of the day, we are simply dubiously speculating about Adolf Hitler's mental illness because, let's be honest guys, we're never really going to know for sure. This is just one of those things that whatever the real answer is, we're never going to know it. The next question we need to ask ourselves is, does this remove the responsibility for the crimes of the Third Reich? So not just the war, not just the Holocaust, but all the terrible things that happened under that horrible regime, right? Does that somehow alleviate the responsibility? I don't really have a solid answer on that one. Generally, I feel much more lenient toward criminals that have, oh, I did this because, I have some kind of mental illness and, that's the reason I was screaming the F word at the grocery store, right? I got Tourette's. So maybe we can forgive those people, but when it comes to something like this, I'm just not sure it's apples to apples. I'm going to lean toward no, but feel free to disagree. You guys let me know your thoughts, and maybe we can have a thoughtful discussion in the comment section. Another thing we need to acknowledge is the diverse range of possible mental illnesses. It kind of shows that anything is possible. So it could be anything from a very, very long list of things. It can be one or some of these things. It can be all of them. It could be none of them. And on the flip side of that coin, there's also the possibility that Hitler was not mentally ill at all. In fact, there are a lot of people who have argued that Hitler is not mentally ill, that he knew exactly what he was doing, because being evil does not necessarily make you insane, right? In fact, you need a good relationship with reality in order to seize power, right? And Hitler was really good at that. He was very influential and very, he just knew what to do, what to say, who to say it to, how to say it. So there are quite a few notable historians who have argued that Hitler has no mental illness. Some of these include, the late and great Ian Kershaw, right? Love that guy. There's Alan Bullock, Hugh Trevor Roper, and A.G.P. Taylor, and quite a few more, right? We're not going to list every single one of them, but these are some of the bigger names that say, nah, Hitler knew what he was doing. So with the understanding that we are dubiously speculating, we are diagnosing Hitler from afar, and a lot of historians don't think he was mentally ill, with all that out of the way, let's start dubiously speculating about Hitler's mental illness. So here's a very short list, and these are actually not all the possibilities. I just couldn't fit it on the screen at one time. But these are just some of the things that people have argued that Hitler had in some way, shape, or form. So we got histrionic personality disorder, which is more or less attention-seeking. We got schizophrenia, psychotic drug abuse, psychopathy, narcissistic personality disorder, sadistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, PTSD. And then we've got some of these other weird ones. So some people have argued for abnormal brain lateralization, where basically his brain was oddly developed, in the hemispheres, and we'll get more into that in the episode. Other people have argued for bipolar disorder, Asperger's, autism. So really, just looking at this very short list, and remember, there are more. Anything is possible. It could be one or two of these things. It could be some. It could be none. It could be all of them. And we're never gonna know. So let's get into some of the big ones. So we are going to start with the majority opinions. The opinions that generally do hold weight in not just the historical side of things, right, with historians, but also with psychologists and the medical industry, because everyone likes to weigh in on this question. I was actually shocked by how many people have dedicated just so many hours at their day jobs at, these universities and these professors and these really smart people. And they're like, you know what I'm going to do today at work? We are going to go see if Hitler was mentally ill or not. And man, I just can't tell you what a wonderful job that must be. So the first big one that people have been saying for a very, very long time is hysteria. So more or less extreme emotional states. I believe that this today would fall under a different category. Hysteria is kind of like one of those old, outdated terms. It does not necessarily mean they are evil or bad people, but it is what it is. And people are susceptible to these extreme emotional states. So one of the big pieces of evidence in support of this theory is actually Hitler's stay at the hospital toward the end of World War I. So as you guys, I'm sure I'm sure you've heard this story on this channel before, but I'll tell it again. So Hitler was fighting during World War I. He was doing, going hard, fighting for the fatherland, and he was gassed. And he didn't have his gas mask ready, he just didn't have it in time, and he ended up going blind for a short period of time. So he's chilling out in the hospital while he's recovering from this, and he starts getting his sight back. So he's starting to heal a little bit, he's recovering, and then he gets the news. He gets the news that Germany surrendered, that the war was over, that while he was in the hospital, it all went downhill. All went downhill. And he claims in Mein Kampf that he went blind again. So he says that, he got this terrible news and he straight up lost his vision again. He doesn't say how long he lost it, but if this is the case, if this actually did happen, it would be a symptom of hysteria, right? Like clinically, this is what happens when people have this mental illness. Now, we also need to acknowledge the possibility that Adolf Hitler was exaggerating. Maybe he was lying in Mein Kampf. Let's not forget he wrote that largely to present himself as, he wants a certain kind of image, right? He had this crazy messiah complex. He wanted people to see him as a god, as the savior of Germany. And that kind of made it seem that way, right? During Germany's worst defeat, I went blind again. That's how much I love Germany, right? So there's a possibility that he just exaggerated that, maybe made it up. We don't know for sure. We only have his word in Mein Kampf. But if it did indeed happen, classical symptom of hysteria. And hysteria is kind of an old, outdated term. We wouldn't say someone has hysteria these days. We would say they have histrionic personality disorder or possibly dissociative disorder, right? So he's somewhere out there. He's possibly got something where he just has these extreme emotional states, whether they're good, whether they're bad. And this lines up with some of the really important psychological research done on Hitler by the US government, actually. So during the war, the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, they did this big, massive report, more or less the psychology of Hitler. They wanted to find out what they were going to have to do, what they were going to have to say if and when they got to Germany, right? And they got Hitler to surrender, and they needed all this psychological research to understand what to do. This is more or less the opinion they had of Adolf Hitler, and this was according to a lot of people that were defectors, people that left Germany because it just got too crazy, a lot of people that were big in the psychology field, right, at the time. A lot of big names were working on this, and this is more or less what they thought. Now, the next big one is schizophrenia, where Hitler was more or less seeing and hearing things that were in fact not there. And this was actually an argument made even before World War II, right? People were saying that he was a schizophrenic because, during his lifetime, he was liberating the German people from the Jews, right? These evil oppressors, right? These terrible monsters. It is just such a hyperbolic thing to believe. I mean, this guy literally thought that the Jews, they controlled the entire world, that they were behind every horrible thing that happened, that Germany was, on its downtrend, not, for any real reasons or, mistakes by the German government, but because the Jews, were setting things up and screwing over the German people. If you want to understand how crazy it really is, you need to picture an alien conspiracy theorist who has political power. So people that really take the whole alien conspiracy theories things, some of those people are pretty out there, right? We got the tinfoil hat people, I've been abducted by aliens, right? I can never prove it, but, I've been abducted. They experiment on me, right? That old Xenon was putting his poker where the sun don't shine, right? Pretty typical stuff. But when you have these people and they have control over stuff, it's kind of scary because they make real political decisions that are going to change people's lives based on this other information. So you just have to imagine someone that is just a hardcore alien conspiracy theorist, and they become the president of the United States, and they're crazy on aliens. They think that aliens are the biggest threat, right? And they shift all the budget. They're like, we're going to fight the space aliens. We got to get this colony on Mars. That's going to be one of our proxy protector planets, right? It changes real things, right? All because of, some pretty loopy information. And that is exactly the kind of dynamic that was going on with Hitler and the Jews. It's schizophrenia. So one of the first people to do this, at least in a public and a professional way, was W.H.D. Vernon, who argued in a 1942 essay that Hitler suffered from hallucinations, hearing voices, paranoia, and megalomania. We don't really know this for sure, but this was one of the leading psychologists of the day. And again, he was diagnosing from afar. But if you look at some of Hitler's actions, some of the kind of propaganda he was pushing to people, there very well could have been hallucinations and, hearing these different voices that, maybe it was, the voice of the Jews. Maybe it was, he thought it was the voice of God, we just don't know what was going on inside his head. So about a year later, Vernon met with the Harvard psychologist Henry Murray and developed the theory a little bit further. And upon further analysis, they kind of realized that he had a lot of classic signs of schizophrenia. So he had this hypersensitivity, he had panic attacks, irrational jealousy, paranoia, omnipotence fantasies, delusions of grandeur, belief in a messianic mission, and extreme paranoia. Now, I am not a medical professional, but that, a lot of those symptoms do very much sound like schizophrenia. If you guys have ever seen that movie or read the book, A Beautiful Mind, where, the main character, he has schizophrenia, and he thinks that he's being, contacted by the U.S. government to save the world in only a way that he could, right? There are these delusions of grandeur. I really could see Hitler being in that way, right? I can just totally see him. He thinks that there's just this evil, crazy, demonic conspiracy theory going on with the Jews and the communists and everyone else in the world, and they're all in on it, and they're all against us. Unfortunately, that theory kind of resonated with a lot of German people, to the detriment of Germany, right? Both Vernon and Murray thought that Hitler would eventually lose faith in this, idea, this crazy worldview that he had, and would commit suicide. Now, history has shown that is not necessarily what happened. I think he really committed suicide only to escape the consequences of his actions, and not necessarily because he lost faith. But, had World War II maybe been postponed, maybe if it didn't happen the way it did, maybe if it was a stalemate and the regime continued to exist, maybe under those circumstances he would have lost faith. Absolutely a possibility. We just don't know for sure. So another psychologist, Wolfgang Schreher, I apologize, I am bad at pronouncing things. So Wolfgang argued that Hitler stayed in touch with reality by changing it. So more or less that he could avoid the schizophrenic withdrawal because he had this position of power. And this is actually, I think, a very good insight if he was in fact schizophrenic, right? And there's a very good possibility this is one of the leading opinions. So if he was schizophrenic, he was able to avoid, reality coming crashing down and, proving everything he believed was wrong, right? Which is pretty common. Most people that have these schizophrenic delusions, they eventually run into some piece of reality that shows, oh, hey, maybe I'm not the savior of the world. Maybe I'm not this great person that can, stop the evil monsters from overwhelming humanity. Maybe I'm wrong. But when Hitler more or less became the Führer of Germany, he could avoid any of that because he could just pass laws and, just kind of supported, right? And it was all constantly reinforced by a lot of the people inside of the Nazi party. Clinical psychologist Edlif Schwab published a psychobiography, sounds very interesting, in 1992, and he argued that it went back to his childhood, that a lot of this schizophrenia can just be traced back to possible abuse by his father, maybe a distant mother who couldn't quite love her son. Who knows? We'll talk more about the parental aspect here in a minute. Now, there was a really vast interdisciplinary approach done by Paul Matasuk, Peter Matasuk, and John Marbach. And, these guys were all professionals in very different fields, right? Everything from media, communication, to psychology and history. And their whole team argued that Hitler and the Nazis, they stabilized each other. So, if you guys have seen my other episode, the memoir of Ernst Hanfstaengl, you guys will know that Hitler was largely having his own crazy ideas reinforced to him by some of the really up there people, right? The people that he was close to, people like, there was Joseph Goebbels, Himmler was pretty nuts. Then there was Alfred Rosenberg, who was like the most radical of the radical in the Nazi party. And a lot of these guys, maybe they had a similar mental illness. Maybe they were just all feeding into Hitler's mental illness, right? You almost have to wonder, to a certain extent, was Hitler's schizophrenia contagious? If you look at how many people in Germany at the time agreed with him, maybe so. Maybe so. But a lot of these guys, they took the most radical ideas and they just echoed it back and forth. And they just became more and more extreme, where maybe early on in the Nazi party, they had some things that, I don't really care for that. This or that is kind of goofy, but, some of the other stuff, they have a point. But as the years went on, they just had this insanity, this schizophrenia, these crazy worldview and theories reinforced and doubled down on to a point where it was just nuts, right? The late Nazi party, pretty insane. And what it does is it creates a new normal. So yeah, we all believe in the Nordic race theory that us Germans are ethnically superior to every other group of people on the planet. Right? And it just becomes the new normal. Like, everyone just starts accepting this. And the scary part is that it was all these nutty people inside the Nazi Party. The Nazi Party controlled the government, and when you control the government, you can basically get a whole bunch of people in your country to go along with it. And that just created a new normal that just continued to descend and descend into what it eventually became. In 2007, there was a research team from the University of Colorado that conducted an elaborate psychological assessment, right? They wanted to get to the bottom of it. Was Hitler mentally ill? And if so, what were those mental illnesses? And they came to the conclusion that he had traits of paranoia, antisocial personality disorder, sadism, narcissistic personality disorder, and PTSD. So they more or less argue that it was not one thing, but it was a combination of these things, which is actually a very good segue into the next big idea here. And this is the idea that Hitler had antisocial personality disorder, which had previously been psychopathy. And this is generally characterized by a lack of empathy, a lack of social responsibility, and a lack of a conscience. One of the first people to make this argument was the psychiatrist Gustav Bykowski. I believe he was a Polish-American, and he wrote a book, Dictators and Disciples, in 1948. And he argued that psychopathic tendencies are basically a necessary component in figures who successfully overthrow governments. So if you want to successfully overthrow the government, you essentially need to be a bit of a psychopath. You need to have antisocial personality disorder. And he argued that this wasn't just the case in Hitler, but also in Julius Caesar, in Cromwell, in Robespierre, Hitler. I think he even had Stalin in there. You know what? It really could be a possibility, because if you look at any one of these figures, right, with the available research and, the sources, right, farther back you go, the worse it gets. But the more you look at these people, you realize they really did show quite a few signs of these things, right? Not just Hitler, but also, right, Robespierre. I mean, I definitely think Robespierre had antisocial personality disorder. In 1993, there was a widespread study by British historians and psychologists. They largely came to the same conclusion, although some of them argue that Hitler also had histrionic personality disorder, so some attention seeking and other things like that. So you guys can see now that there is so much possible overlap. And a lot of these great thinkers, right, a lot of these psychologists and psychiatrists and historians, a lot of them really believe that it's not just one thing that's like, oh, it's definitively this. Some of them do, but a lot of them think that it is just a combination of some of these things. So what is on the mental illness cocktail for Adolf Hitler? Right? I'll have a little bit of antisocial personality disorder. I'll have some hysteria. I'll have some schizophrenia. Right? Let's see what else we can get into the mix. All right. So now we've gotten some of the really big opinions out there. We can get into the fun stuff. The really good stuff, the depth psychology. So this is more or less the approach of trying to analyze the relationship between the conscious and the unconscious, largely based off of people like Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Alfred Adler. This approach is typically not, let's find a definition of a mental illness and just, stick it on Hitler, right? It's not really that kind of approach. This is more of, we analyze some of the things in his past, his childhood, his relationships with people, the kind of behavior that was encouraged, right? It's just generally, there's more depth. And I do like this approach because I think it, the other stuff is useful, right? To be able to say, all right, this person definitely had antisocial personality disorder. That is useful. But when it comes to psychology, there's just so many factors at play inside of the human mind, and you need depth, right? Every single person is a crazy rabbit hole you can go down and never even find the final answer for. So one of the best people to do this was actually Swiss childhood researcher Alice Miller. And she argued that Hitler's father Alois could be seen as a prototype of a totalitarian regime. And this is a really interesting approach because when you think about the way he was raised, right, at least according to outside sources, Hitler kind of painted a really positive picture of his father, especially in Mein Kampf. But there is a very good possibility that Hitler was just crazily abused. I mean, a lot of fathers at the time were very much abusive, right? Not only is this that point in history when people just loved beating their kids, but there's also, this German cultural thing where people were very militaristic. It was very, there was something about being that overbearing, dominant man, that was just very popular at the time. And unfortunately, a lot of those guys took it out on their kids, right? So how am I going to prove my authority in my own household? Well, I'm going to beat the crap out of my son. That's kind of the way it went. So Miller more or less argued that Hitler's cruelty emerged from this abuse by his father. And then she also argued that Hitler's mother could not connect with him emotionally because she had already lost 3 children prior. Hitler's mom, I think her name was Clara, she had a whole bunch of miscarriages, the kids died. I mean, it was a really hard thing to go through, right? I mean, medicine and science was not where it is today, so there is a good possibility that if you had 5 kids, 4 of them were going to die. And she just lost so many kids, and she just probably tried not to connect with them very much, right? To kind of deal with the blow. I mean, if you got 3 kids, 3 of them die. I mean, why would you want to connect with the 4th? So that could be why she didn't really connect with Adolf very well. And then, you got that from his mom, and then you've got this abusive, tyrannical father figure, and you got a recipe for, not a very good childhood. Hitler even mentions identifying with his father, even though his father was this crazy, abusive tyrant. He told him he couldn't be an artist. He, beat him, right? I mean, there are some stories that come from Hitler's sister from her diary. Crazy stuff going on. But despite all of the horrible stuff that his father did, he still identified with him, still liked him. And maybe he, in creating the Third Reich, right, that entire system of government, he was recreating his own childhood. In fact, if you look at a lot of the early Nazi Party members, right, guys like Goebbels and Himmler, a lot of them, they were attracted for maybe the same reasons. I mean, a lot of these guys also came from abusive fathers and terrible home lives. And, Joseph Goebbels, he was just this weird, scrawny kid and just always beat down and kind of ignored and neglected by everyone. You had Himmler, who his father was literally notorious for being strict and domineering with kids. Very good possibility that just all these guys were gravitating toward their idealized father figures that abused them. And then we've got some French psychoanalysts, Bella Grunberger and Pierre Dossuin, who argue that Hitler's narcissism stemmed from his alleged sexual practices and constipation problems. So we actually know from Hitler's personal doctor that he did have constipation problems. Now, what gets weird, and this is where we've gone into very weird territory, so brace yourselves. So Hitler was allegedly practicing some pretty weird sexual stuff. So there are some people that have claimed that he was a neuter, that he could not have sex. And then we also had people that claimed that he had some weird fetishes. Basically, he was attracted to waste. So he wanted to get pooped on. Maybe he wanted to poop on people. Maybe he wanted to pee on people. Like, I just don't know. There are so many people that have argued this, right? Some of this, came from his political opponents, right? I mean, what better way to score political points than to say the other guy wants to get shit on? That's what you do, right? And again, on the sexual stuff, we don't really know what his fetishes were. We don't know what he did, what he didn't do, what he was into but didn't do. You just don't know. it is all really speculative, but, the idea that his narcissism goes back to these sexual practices, could really hold weight, right? Especially when you have such a weirdly developed sexual life, right? That's something that is kind of taken away from you, not to be able to enjoy sex in a normal, healthy way. That will really mess you up. And, Ernst Hanfstaengl, who was Hitler's close friend and an early party financer, he argued that Hitler's narcissism and all that, went back to his inability to have sex, right? That Hitler was just this crazy maniacal guy that had all this energy and drive because he couldn't have sex, right? It makes people happy, right? And he just couldn't get that. So who knows? All right, so now we are going to get into some minority opinions, which may be a little bit more interesting, but, they're kind of largely ignored. Some of them have been, I don't want to say debunked, but there have been some really good arguments against some of these. So just bear that in mind. There are not a whole lot of people that subscribe to these ideas, but let's start with them. So one of the big ones is autism, or Hitler being, on the spectrum, right? Having Asperger's. Now, this idea is relatively recent. So, Professor of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, Michael Fitzgerald, published his anthology in 2004. And he classified Hitler as an autistic psychopath. So, autism is, they have social anxiety, they're kind of weird, they just can't connect with people in any normal, meaningful way. You know what? That really could be the case, right? If we just look at some of the personality traits about Hitler that are verified and confirmed, a lot of them do really line up with autism. So we've got his obsession with things, right? This is typically an autistic thing, right? You get crazy obsessed with, just one thing and it becomes your all. There's also the lifeless gaze. He was socially awkward. He had a lack of personal friendships. He had a tendency toward monologues because he couldn't hold a real conversation. And this even lines up with, his childhood best friend, August Kubizek, who later wrote a memoir. And Kubizek claimed that even when they were like kids, right, like 14, 15 years old, they didn't really have a conversation. Hitler would just go on these big, massive speeches. And he would just rant and rave and just go on. And, Kubizek just more or less listened. Right. So that totally could be the case, right? And I'm actually surprised that it's only 2004 that someone proposed this theory because, looking back at it now, I think, it really could hold some weight, right? Maybe, in due time, more people will come around to this one. But, again, for now, it is a minority opinion. All right, so the next one we've got is actually a new mental illness created specifically for dangerous leaders called, brilliantly named Dangerous Leader Disorder. And this one was put forth by personality psychologist John D. Mayer, and he published an essay in 1993. And he argued that there should be a new psychiatric category for these people that have really destructive personalities that are in positions of leadership, especially like big countries, right? And of course, he applied this not only to Hitler, but also to people like Stalin, Saddam Hussein could have had some of these. So Mayer has this new psychiatric category, the dangerous leader disorder, and these people have 3 typical traits. So it's indifference to genocide. So I don't care if my enemies are being killed or slaughtered, sent to the concentration camp, doesn't make any difference to me. There's an intolerance to opposition. So they don't allow freedom of speech. They don't allow there to be political nuance, right? Even the people that are like, that are on board with most of the stuff, but if they disagree on like 2% of the party program, they're out. They're in the concentration camps too. And then there's also this element of self-aggrandizement. They take narcissism to the absolute extreme, and they want everyone in their country to basically worship them as if they were a god. I don't know if it calls for a new category, right? It feels weird making a new psychological category for people that are, political leaders that are crazy, right? These dictators. But I don't know. It could be. Maybe there should be, right? I mean, these people are kind of different to everyone else. So I'll leave that question up to you guys. Do political leaders deserve their own psychiatric category? And then the next theory we've got here is abnormal brain lateralization, which is a very fancy way of saying that Hitler had a brain that developed bad, right? More or less, his hemispheres, they didn't develop properly, and it, kind of overemphasized certain behaviors and personality aspects. So this one there was an essay published in 1976. There was Colin Martindale, Nancy Hassenfuss, Dwight Hines. Again, I apologize for the mispronunciation. But in this essay, they argued that Hitler suffered from a subfunction of the left hemisphere of the brain. So they pointed to the tremor of his left limbs, his leftward eye movements, and his alleged missing left testicle. You just gotta love some of these theories, man. The missing testicle was it's a good one. But, they argued that this problem in his brain explained his irrationality, his auditory hallucinations, and his uncontrolled outbursts, right? Who knows? I am not a neuroscientist, right? I'll be the first to preface that, just in case you guys thought I was. But, it really could be, really could not be. Again, I'm not an expert, but these people are experts. So understand that it is a possibility, and it does tie in with the schizophrenia theory. So maybe it could be, Hitler had abnormal brain lateralization in addition to, and that fed off of his schizophrenia. Could be. Absolutely could be. And they even argued that his suspected right hemisphere dominance of the brain contributed to his political ideology of anti-Semitism and Lebensraum, right? There's a whole rabbit hole to go down there. Hitler was kind of like a clean freak, and, maybe this was kind of his way of, exterminating the filth of Germany, right? Get rid of the Jews, the minorities, all that kind of stuff, right? Increase the living space for the German people. Could be driven by his abnormally developed right hemisphere. Who knows? And now we have finally come full circle to the idea that he may not have been mentally ill at all. As American psychologist Glenn D. Walters wrote in 2000, much of the debate about Hitler's long-term mental health is probably questionable because even if he had suffered from significant psychiatric problems, he attained the supreme power in Germany rather in spite of these difficulties than through them. Right? I mean, the idea does hold weight. If Hitler had all these mental illnesses, or at least some of them, it would have been a big impediment to becoming powerful. It would have just made things exponentially more difficult, right? I mean, surviving and thriving when you have mental illnesses is difficult, right? Even in our modern world where, we've got medications and we've got psychiatrists and people that can help you, right? Whatever you've got, right? If anything from depression to schizophrenia, you can be helped. You can, be made normal. But at the time, I mean, people just lived with it. They didn't even understand the concept of mental illness. I am not sure what I think. Personally, I could totally see what Walters is saying here, right? The idea that Hitler did all this despite his these mental illnesses, it just doesn't sound right. But at the same time, I really could see some of them, right? Especially schizophrenia. I could totally see that one, and feeding into his rampant anti-Semitism. Who knows? I definitely want to hear from you guys in the comment section if you're watching on YouTube. So be sure to let me know what you guys think. I'm looking forward to having some good discussions down there. But that is going to be it for the video. Thank you so much for watching. Again, make sure to check out the Patreon page for bonus content, more episodes. Maybe you want to get a shout out at the start of the episode. Go check it out. But this has been Michael from History for Thinkers. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.